So, Mary, Mom of God. Well, let's do this. There we go. A candid conversation. There is no point in trying to tie the Christmas story that we have, all the myths, the legends, the many, many, many small stories and large. We can't tie it to factual history, guys. Sorry, it's just been too long. The stories were written from hearsay and rumor, the need to make Jesus' story speak to a world imbued with magic and superstition, hungry for hope. And so, the sources of information that we have are hopelessly muddied and complexified by cross-cultural contamination, too. Because, of course, the teachings of Jesus came into a world where religious sects and beliefs were as varied and entangled as they are today. Jewish, Roman, Greek, Persian, and Egyptian stories all contributed to our nativity narrative. So, it is, in that case, a story. Stories are how we teach. Stories are how we learn. Stories are how we pass information about everything from how to make grandma's cherry pie to how to react to bad news. Stories can be interpreted and misinterpreted in 100,000 ways. They change and they grow, they adapt, they take unexpected turns. I love that we tell stories, and I love how we tell them. And I also, even more than that, I love that we change them. We make them new. We bring them what we need, and we bring ourselves to them. I love changing stories. Huge thing. I love to take them apart and tell them in new ways. We all do in our fashion. And one of the ways that I do that is I write fan fiction. Yes, I will not be telling you anything about my online presence. Thank you very much. However, and I haven't in years, but I still love it. Fan fiction is the intentional retelling of a previously told story with changes and additions and subtractions. So, for instance, what if Luke Skywalker was a woman? Great fan fiction. What if, in Pretty Woman, Julia Roberts was actually a shape-shifting star spawn who was offspring of the hideous Cthulhu and his sister Cthulhu, and instead of falling in love with Richard Gere, she opened her mouth and transformed into a tentacled beast and swallowed him whole before moving on to consume the rest of Los Angeles? That would be a great fan fiction story. These are just some ideas I've had. So I'm going to come back to today. Every story that we have about the birth of Jesus is fan fiction. Okay, they all are. So what I'm going to give to you today is one more story. And it has significantly fewer tentacles than you might now be hoping for. This is a very UU interview with Mary, Mom of God. I sat down to interview Mary, daughter of Joachim and Anne, mother of Jesus the Christ, spouse of God and Joseph, on a chilly day in late December. She was smaller than I thought she would be, with intense brown eyes and an expressive face. She spoke as much with her hands and her face as with her voice. "So, Mary," I said, "take me back to that first trip to Bethlehem. Why were you and Joseph on the road?" "Well, we said we had to go to Bethlehem for the census, but a lot of it was just wanting to get away from my parents. I mean, I loved them, of course, but they were having a hard time with the whole Son of God thing. My dad kept muttering to himself and giving Joseph dirty looks. And my mom was all, Did they believe you? Oh, yes, they did, I guess. They definitely did later. My dad even apologized for calling me a whore after Jesus cured his gout. But that was a couple of years later. At the time, they were just freaking out, and I was already stressed enough, I can imagine. But a road trip when you're 9 months pregnant seems like a strange choice. It wasn't that far. I mean, my family had been walking to Jerusalem every year for Passover since I was born, and Bethlehem wasn't even as far as that. Plus, Joseph had family there, that whole lineage of David thing, so we knew we'd be fine. Well, wait, if he had family there, why did you end up having the baby in a barn? She rolled her eyes. They I always get that wrong. The inn was a guest house, but it really was full, what with the census and all. The stable was warm and comfy, and it was normal to sleep there if there was no room at the house. Also, it was private, and by the time we got to Bethlehem, my contractions were like 3 minutes apart. I knew Jesus was on the way. But no one came out to help? Oh yeah, there were 3 women there to help, the midwife and her daughter and another woman, a widow with some experiences of births. That's not in any of the stories. She eyed me. Sure it is. I've heard people singing about the shepherds showing up at the birth. The midwives were shepherds? Duh, she said. A lot of shepherds were women at the time. It's a great job for young people especially, or older widows and widowers. Not too much effort most of the time, plenty of time to spin wool or mend clothes or whatever else needs doing. It's not like being a midwife takes up every day. I nodded. Okay, let's move on. How was the birth? Mary tipped her head to one side, considering the question with an inward gaze. It was fine, she said after a moment. I mean, it's been 2 millennia, and I was in ecstatic communion with God throughout the whole thing, so the details are a little hazy. It hurt and everything, but it was a quick birth, and before you knew it, I was helping the midwives wrap him in swaddling clothes, and he was starting to nurse. And I paused, unsure of how to phrase my question. Well, I guess, Mary, did you know even then who your son was? Who he would become? What he would do? She went still at that. She looked at me steadily. She replied with one word. Yes. We sat quietly for a moment. Her hands were curled together tightly on her lap, work-worn and brown against the royal blue of her pantsuit. Finally, she spoke again. There's this song now that you sing around his birthday. It says, Mary, did you know? And it lists all these things my son did and asks if I knew how special he was. Well, let me just clear that up right away. Of course I knew! Are you kidding? She began to be more relaxed, her hands lifting to illustrate the story as she spoke. A freaking angel came down and told me. I knew. And then when I went to see Elizabeth, because she was the only cousin crazy enough that I thought she might believe me, she was all, OMG, you got knocked up by Adonai? That's crazy. She rolled her eyes. Yeah, I knew, okay? You can stop asking that question. Did you know? I took a deep breath. Did you know how it was going to end? Not exactly, but the general outline. She looked away. Yes. She was silent for a moment and then went on. You have to understand, we were at war. It was a stupid, useless, pointless, hopeless war, but my people were desperate. Mostly we could just live our lives. People farmed and had some goats and maybe an ox if they were well off. Some people were crafters, like Joseph. He was a good carpenter. But hardly anyone owned their land anymore. It was all taken by lenders, estate owners. How did they take it? I interrupted. Oh, it was mostly legal. A family would have a bad year, borrow to buy seed, scraping by, but never quite managing to repay the full debt. One more bad season, not enough rain, too much rain, and that was it. The land passes to the lender, and suddenly you're working your own land for someone else's benefit. Well, that sucks. It really does. And then taxes kept being raised, another way to help people lose their land, and the prices of food went up. Lots of people were homeless, and the young men would gather out in caves outside the villages, and they would egg each other on. They'd become bandits or rebels against the empire, or both. It was kind of as the opportunity arose. Her eyes locked onto mine. The roads were lined with crucifixions. Every crossroad had one or two. And when a cave got cleaned out by Herod or the Romans, they would go up like a forest. Everyone knew someone who had died on the cross. So Gabriel comes to visit me and says his piece, and then crazy old cousin Elizabeth says hers, and I knew. What did you think that song of praise was about? The Magnificat. Mary looked put out. I worked hard on that thing. I looked down at my notes. Some people claim it was just a rehash of Hannah's song in the time of Samuel. She sat back in her chair with her arms folded. Some people can kiss my holy tookus. Okay, I paged through my notes a little more. Just a few more questions. Mary sighed and reached for her coffee cup. Fine. Okay, did the animals really talk the night that Jesus was born? She snorted. No, I think that story is pure Middle Ages wishful thinking. Gotcha. I scanned my page of questions. Oh, here's one for you. I looked up. What was your relationship with God like? I got another eye roll. You know, God never talked directly to me. Not even once. God sent angels. God sent premonitions. Apparently, God sent my batty cousin. But never once did that deity speak directly to me. Huh. Yeah, although it's probably good that one of my spouses was shut up because Joseph was a real chatty Cathy. That dude never stopped with the talking. Wait a minute, I said. What about when Jesus spoke to you? Wasn't that God talking to you? She looked at me strangely. Do you have kids? Yes, I admitted. Do you ever think you're talking to God when you're talking to your kid? No. Oh my God, she exclaimed, throwing her hands into the air. Nobody gets it. Nobody gets it. 2,000 years and enough schlocky nativity carols to choke a donkey. She leaned forward and stared into my eyes. When you talk to your kid, you are talking to God. She pointed at me and then at herself. When you talk to me, you are talking to God. When I talk to you, I am talking to God. That's the whole point. That was the whole reason Jesus was born. That's everything he ever said. Every person contains the potential to be him, to be God. Every person contains the holy spark. Sure, my kid was an honor roll student, and yours probably got solid C's, but all it takes is belief in yourself and a whole lot of hard work, and you too can heal the sick, raise the dead, cast out demons, transform cultures, and change the world. She looked tired, suddenly, and get crucified, because that's how it tends to go. Well, it doesn't have to, I said. Mary nodded. That is the other point, she agreed, that challenge and change and transformation don't have to end in crucifixion. She straightened and began to speak, sounding both practiced and determined, as though these were words she had said or rehearsed 1,000 times before. My son, he was the Son of God. There was an angel, there was Cousin Elizabeth, there were signs and portents of his birth. There was this star. We haven't even talked about the star or the wise men. She shook her head. I don't want to get distracted. I gave birth in a stable with 3 shepherds and Joseph. And yes, there were some angels singing. I mentioned that ecstatic communion with God, right? I nodded and she went on. Jesus was sent by God, but the whole point of the story is Jesus was as human as you and me. He had a head start on some stuff. You know, he talked right after birth, healing, yada, yada, yada. But even that was mostly exaggerated in the Gospels. She shook her head. People are suckers for a spectacle, and you have to get their attention somehow. But what my son mostly did, do you know what he did most of the time? I shook my head. He told stories. We were at war, and he told stories. It was a stupid, useless, pointless war, but my people were desperate. We needed something. And God is the God of abundance and love, and so God answered our desperation. But with what? With what? With my smart-mouthed son, who never once put his sandals away when he kicked them off, this scrawny kid who turned into a scrawny man. He was kind of short, and he never ate enough. I know all Jewish mothers think their sons don't eat enough, but Jesus, he was always headed out the door, one on the road, fasting, hanging out in the desert, wrestling with his own demons. Eat some damn falafel, kid. She shook her head. So Jesus came and he told us all a story. He told it in 100 ways, and it was always the same story. Be a better human. Be more human. He talked about the power of being human, the power we have to hurt one another, and the power we have to heal and to help one another. It's a human thing. That was his whole point. Sure, he was the child of God, and so are you, and so am I. Listen, she said, jabbing her finger at me. Listen. Every person is as much the child of God as my son. Every one of us has the potential to do what he did. There are choirs of angels singing at every birth, even if you can't hear them. And every single infant carries gifts to the world, even if they're less spectacular than raising the dead. All my son ever did was tell a story. And people still don't get the point, and oi, that is discouraging. I think some people get it, I said after a silence. She said, tilting her head. Yeah, I mean, there's so many people these days, right? Some of them definitely get it. And it's not like Jesus is the only way to get it. There's Muhammad and Baha'u'llah and Buddha and lots of others. They're all telling the story too. Be more human. Be better at being human. Wait. What about the Gospel of John, where Jesus keeps saying he's the only way to God? Mary rolled her eyes. That dude, John of Patmos? I nodded. He was as crazy as a bedbug. I mean, he wrote some good stuff, really poetic and all, but he wrote it way after Jesus left, and he had this whole agenda. So, read John with a grain of salt. She made the cuckoo gesture at her ear. I nodded again and looked down at my notes. I think that about wraps it up, I said. Anything you'd like to add that we didn't talk about? Remind me next time to talk about the wise men. They were adorable, Mary said. Other than that, I just want people to read this and know Jesus was as human as you and me. There is nothing he did. Nothing. Literally, not a single act or miracle or speech that you and I couldn't do. My son was born in a stable. Our family was poor. And we spent a lot of our lives as refugees, living under foreign rule, staying one step ahead of a system that did not want people to hear Jesus' message, God's message. The only thing that we had was ourselves. Jesus reminded the people in power that they had twisted and warped God's gifts through their pursuit of wealth and influence, and that scared them. He reminded the poor people that they had power, and that their power lay in love, not hate. And that scared those in power. He was a scrawny Jew whose only real power lay in his belief in himself and his willingness to keep working, talking, helping, healing, pushing. She looked at her hands and then back at me. He was my son, a beautiful baby boy. His birth was a miracle, but every birth is. So what difference does it make? Her eyes met mine, intense and focused. You tell me, I said. No, she said, shaking her head and still regarding me intently. You tell me. What difference does it make?